From the Fox News Podcast Network, I'm Dana Perino, and everything will be okay. Hello and welcome back. Last week, we heard from Jean Becker. There are few people on Earth who knew former President George H.W. Bush and former First Lady Barbara Bush better than Jean. And she shares some excellent advice imparted to her over the years by the 41 family. One of my favorite pieces of advice she shared was to be willing to stand your ground once in a while. This week, my guest is someone who has had to stand her ground a time or two, and a lot of the time, it was on the world stage. I can point to one specific thing my dad did with me that helped me have the career I have today. When I was in third grade, he assigned me to read the Rocky Mountain News and the Denver Post every day before he got home from work. I loved assignments. I had to choose 2 articles to discuss with him before dinner. He would ask me lots of questions about why I made my selections, what I thought of the stories, and then he'd debate other points of view that should be considered. Of all the things that helped in the communications business, this was probably the most important. For those of you who are contemplating or experiencing parenthood, I'd say it's something worth considering, even in our digital age. Condoleezza Rice is the former U.S. Secretary of State, the first African-American woman to fill that title. She also served as a national security advisor, both of those roles under President George W. Bush. Condi has written several books and now serves as the director of the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. Most importantly, she is a daughter, and today we'll focus on how her father influenced her life and shaped her into the woman she is today. Secretary Rice, although I know you asked me to call you Condi, I have a hard time doing that because of the respect, but I'll try. Condi, tell us about your father's childhood, his upbringing.
My dad was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He was born in 1923. So it was a pretty tough time to be Black in Louisiana, but he came from a very stable family. His father was a Presbyterian minister and a school principal. He had actually managed to get himself college educated by going to Little Stillman College and promising to become a Presbyterian minister in exchange for a scholarship. So his father was educated and very bookish, kind of an intellectual. I'll tell you something about that in just a minute. His mom was a stay-at-home mom, but very much the kind of figure of strength and got the family through the Depression in good shape. And then his sister, Teresa, was really, really a great student and eventually would end up with a PhD from the University of Wisconsin in Victorian literature. So he came from an unusual family, I guess, for that time where education and intellect were really valued. As a matter of fact, on the day that I got my PhD, my father gave me 6 leather-bound, gold-embossed books. And they were the works of Hugo, the works of Shakespeare. And I was told that these were books that my grandfather had bought at the height of the Great Depression. He paid $90 for them. My grandmother was furious because she was just trying to get the family through the Depression, but he hung on to those books. And it just sort of showed how much the whole idea of study and intellect were at the center of their lives as my father grew up.
And then you are born, and how does he think about parenting you? Obviously, he couldn't know that you would become Secretary of State and have all of these moments in history where you play a pivotal role. But was there an approach he had early on with you that you can talk about?
Well, I have to finish his story a little bit because then he would go on to college and seminary, do a master's in divinity, and at Johnson C. Smith University in North Carolina, which is historically Black college. But then he'd move to Birmingham, Alabama, where he would meet Angelina Ray, my mother. They were both teaching at Fairfield Industrial High School. So the first hint that I had that my father was really a feminist was many years later. I asked him the following question. Birmingham had a nepotism law. So once my parents were married, they couldn't teach in the same school. And so I said to my father, well, Daddy, why did you leave? Because he left and went to teach in another district. He said, well, because your mother was there first. So it would never have occurred to him that somehow her career was less important than his. And from the day I was born, I'm told that he thought I could do anything. I was an only child. And so I was raised to believe I could do anything. It was music with my mother. With my father, it was history and sports. He was also a football player in his earlier days. He was a huge man, 6'3", very imposing figure. And he taught me all about sports from the age of 3. I can remember Dana sitting there in front of the TV with him, and he would say, Condoleezza, what are they doing now? Oh, Daddy, that's a trap block. So he really encouraged my love of sports. But most importantly, my parents didn't have that sense of role differentiation. Mother had a role, Daddy had a role. They both pulled their weight. They were both intellectuals, both professionals. And he sort of passed that on to me.
Tell me a little bit about that civil rights movement and his and your mother's, of course, thinking at that time. I was struck by one of the things that you said in your book that you said, I would even say that my parents and their friends in our community thought of education as kind of an armor against racism. If you were well educated and you spoke well, then there was only so much they could do to you.
Right. Education was kind of the holy grail. It was faith, family, and education in my little community in Birmingham. It was a community that I think everybody taught school. Then I think there was one lawyer and one doctor, and everybody else taught school. And so education was supposed to be your way of making sure that segregation didn't hold you back. Remember, this is segregated Birmingham, Alabama. You can't go to a movie theater. You can't go to a restaurant. There are terrible images of Black people everywhere. But in our little community, they were determined that their children were not going to be held hostage to that. And so they had really these 3 mantras. One was, you have to be twice as good. Now, this wasn't said as a matter of debate. It was said as a matter of fact. And if you were twice as good, then you would beat them at their own game. So we went around trying to be twice as good, twice as confident, because we worked twice as hard. They said there are no victims. You may not be able to control your circumstances, but you can control your response to your circumstances. And the minute you think of yourself as a victim, you have given control of your life to somebody else. And then one that my father, I remember it was his and his alone. We'd actually moved from that little segregated community in Birmingham. Civil rights movement had come along. We'd gone to Tuscaloosa, where my dad was dean of students at Stillman College, and historically Black college. And then he decided he wanted to get a master's degree in student personnel administration so he could do college work. That's what took us to Denver. Within a reasonable period of time, he was offered a job at the University of Denver. We stayed in Denver. Now, you might think this is a kind of odd circumstance. I've grown up in segregated Birmingham, Alabama. Race is everything and race is nothing because the races are so segregated. We go to Denver. I'm the segregated schools in Birmingham. I'm one of 3 Black women at St. Mary's Academy, a college prep school. And I come home one day and somebody's not wanted to sit next to me because I'm Black. This is in Denver. My father says, that's just fine as long as they move. So he was saying to me, don't let somebody else's prejudice be your problem. It's their problem. Don't let them make you feel like less of a person because they don't react well to you. Just ignore them. And I kind of grew up with that sense of armor, as you will, because my parents and my mother and father never thought that I was going to grow up in a world without prejudice. It was unimaginable to them.
I bet. There's just one other part on this because you've said this, I have it written down here. You said about the civil rights marches that my father was very clear about why he wouldn't march. My dad was not someone who you would strike with a billy club and he wouldn't strike back. It just wasn't in him. And can you recall how you remember your parents' conversation about that?
For the full podcast, go to foxnewspodcast.com.